John's Gospel begins with a week-long period and it ends with a week-long period. New Testament scholar Richard Bauckham suggests the first week in John and the last week are meant to be compared with each other. He says John tips us off to the intended comparison by starting both weeks at Bethany. I took seriously Baukham's suggestion that we should compare the weeks, but I wanted to see if this could weigh in on the discussion about the book of Genesis in the Gospel of John. Namely, I attempted to compare the 2 weeks over against the creation week. Since John's Gospel begins with an allusion to Genesis, in the beginning was the Word, and then he narrates a week-long period, many have suggested that the week timeline may reflect the influence of the creation week. Except I didn't retain Baukham's layout. I agree with those scholars who say the first week is only 6 days, so not a full week. And I agree with those who say Jesus is crucified on the 6th day of the last week, not the 5th day, as with Bauckham. When this configuration is adopted, something interesting happens. Namely, the wedding at Cana and the crucifixion both fall on the 6th day of their respective weeks, just like the creation of Adam and Eve was on the 6th day. Since these are the 2 episodes in John's Gospel where many interpreters have seen references to the Garden of Eden, these allusions may be reinforced if they take place on the day of the week that corresponds to the creation of humanity in Genesis. So again, note that the first week does not have a Sabbath. According to Klink, the Sabbath cannot yet arrive because Jesus' work week is not yet complete. This results in an extended 6th day that covers the gist of Jesus' ministry. So most of this gospel is a kind of long 6th day in which Jesus continues to work. Sabbath only arrives at the end of the 2nd week because, as Jesus himself will tell us, his work has finally been completed and finished upon the cross. Klink sees the elongated 6th day of the creation week in the series of sign miracles that restore the divine image, and in the discourses on the impartation of life and spirit. So the word for life, Zoe, occurs 47 times in Jesus' ministry, which signals its importance to John and makes sense if we're supposed to be thinking in terms of the day in which God gives life to Adam and Eve. Also note the water theme that John tells us points to the Spirit. This is also ubiquitous throughout this gospel and will culminate with the water flowing from Jesus' side, which John will understand to be the fulfillment of the Edenic waters flowing out of the temple in Ezekiel. Remember, Ezekiel ends with a sort of restored Garden of Eden, only now the river of life is flowing out of the temple. Well, in John's gospel, Jesus is the temple, and so the water flows from his side. The elongated 6th day may inform some of Jesus' Sabbath controversies and his claim that his work is not yet complete. So in 4:34, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to complete his work. In 5:36, the works that the Father has given me to complete, which are the very works that I am doing, again, the same Greek word, teleo. Jesus relates that he must continue working. That is until the conclusion of the 6th day on Passion Week, where Jesus will finally use this same Greek word to say, it is finished, tetelestai. With the work week finally complete, John tells us immediately in the next verse that Sabbath has arrived. Now we turn to the question of Mary. Does she play the role of Eve in John's Gospel? So I'll just say at the outset that I'm not Catholic, I'm Protestant, but this doesn't necessarily mean that Mary does not play a kind of a narrative role in John's Gospel. Just the same as John the Baptizer plays the role of Elijah, it would be totally acceptable for Mary to play the role of Eve. We can acknowledge this without, becoming Catholic and praying the rosary and all these things. But I found it interesting. Here's a citation from a Roman Catholic biblical scholar, he even admits this interpretation must be kept clearly distinct from a later Mariology, which will attach importance to the person of Mary herself. We believe that the Johannine stress is on Mary as a symbol of the Church. And so even a responsible Catholic scholar will not take this language too far, and neither am I attempting to do that either. Adam and Eve's union on the sixth day of creation became the foundation of marriage in Jewish thought. Again, the marriage of Cana is on the sixth day of the week. Mary is called woman by Jesus at the wedding, which wouldn't seem like such a big deal since he calls other women woman, but there is no evidence in the Mediterranean world that it was appropriate for sons to address their mothers this way. This may be John's way of signaling to us that Mary is playing a role beyond being Jesus' historical mother. Adam the bridegroom says, "This is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman." Likewise, Jesus plays the role of bridegroom at the wedding and calls Mary woman. She persuades the groom in the matter of consumption to provide wine for the wedding guests. Eve's infamy is that she persuaded Adam concerning the consumption of the tree of knowledge. And there are a number of Jewish texts at this period that compare the tree of knowledge to the consumption of wine. But as where the consuming of the tree of knowledge led to death, the wine of this wedding points to life. Jesus creating an abundance of wine at Cana is often linked with this passage in Amos, which discusses life in the age to come. The mountains shall drip sweet wine, and all the hills shall flow with it, and they shall plant vineyards and drink their wine, and they shall make gardens and eat their fruit. The wine at Jesus' wedding event in Cana is also linked with his resurrection in the upcoming scene in Jerusalem at the end of John chapter 2. So we know that the wine has to do with life. Again, Eve's infamy is that she facilitated disobedience to the Lord. By contrast, Mary facilitates obedience, telling the servants to do whatever he says. And in Genesis, the consumption facilitated by the woman led to special knowledge. Quote, "Behold, man is become like God, knowing good and evil." Those who listen to the woman at the wedding receive special knowledge as well, a point John is careful to note, saying no one else at the wedding knew about the source of the wine, but the servants who had drawn the water knew. So far, we've explored Mary as Eve the bride, a subject to which we will return. But now we want to explore the notion of Mary as Eve the mother, and obviously Eve was the mother of all living, so this is an important role for any Eve-like character. Look at what it says here in John 19:26. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing by, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." Here he makes the beloved disciple the son of Mary. Nicodemus asks how one can experience the new birth without going back into his mother's womb to be born again. Jesus tells him this can only happen through the Spirit. So I think whenever the beloved disciple becomes Mary's son without being born from her womb, he is intended as a picture of the new birth through the Spirit. And note that the conversation about a mother's womb is embedded in a series of exchanges replete with marital and procreative themes. In fact, Nicodemus and Mary have a way of showing up in the storyline in proximity to each other. Nevertheless, before Nicodemus, we have Jesus and his strange conversation with the woman at the wedding. Afterwards, we have John the Baptizer as best man and Jesus as bridegroom. And then we have the Samaritan woman at the bridal well. She is also a kind of bride, and she has many likenesses to Mary. Mary was on the sixth day, and there were 6 water pots. The woman at the well talks with Jesus at about the 6th hour, and she has had 6 husbands. Her conversation mirrors that of Mary in important respects. She is called woman. She's told about Jesus' coming hour, and there is a conversation about how she should have asked Jesus to provide water, just as Mary asked Jesus to provide wine. So if you compare the conversation Jesus has with the woman at the well and with Mary at the wedding so very similar. I think Mary's maternity of the beloved disciple is meant to be a lesson on the Holy Spirit. Through the Spirit, the language of Jesus' incarnation is sometimes applied to his disciples, language about him not being of the world, but sent into it, for example. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. As you sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. And something similar happens in John 17:24. And so we find that language about Jesus in his incarnation is used of his disciples, even though they aren't incarnated in the same way. Whenever they experience the new birth by the Spirit, their language of origins, where they come from, who they are, what they're doing, ends up sounding like language about Jesus in his incarnation. Just as through the Spirit, the language of Jesus' incarnation is applied to his disciples in other contexts, I think his Marian maternity, which was obviously an important part of his incarnation, is shared with his disciple. I think this is signaled by the order of events at the cross. First, you have the Marian maternity of the beloved disciple pronounced by Jesus. Then you have the flowing water that signals the new birth. Then you have the reintroduction of Nicodemus, who originally asked the question about how one can be born without entering his mother's womb. The beloved disciple is meant to be an answer to this question. Mary becomes the beloved disciple's mother. The water comes out, reminding us of Spirit, reminding us of the new birth. Nicodemus shows up, reminding us of that conversation from John chapter 3. All these elements are showing up at the same time because the beloved disciple is a picture of what it means to be born by the Spirit. And thus, like Jesus, Mary is his mother, right? The language of the incarnation ends up getting shared with the beloved disciple because he is born of the same Spirit that Jesus is born of. I think there are a few passages that are intended to make Mary look specifically Eve-like in terms of her motherhood. Now consider this passage from Genesis. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed, and he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. The proto-evangelion from Genesis 3. I think this passage in Genesis is a controlling allusion for the argument we find between Jesus and the Judaioi in John chapter 8, because the same elements show up as in Genesis chapter 3. Jesus says, "You are of your father the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires." He was a murderer from the beginning, so we're supposed to be thinking about the devil as the serpent in the beginning. For he is a liar and the father of lies. He continues, "You are doing the works your father did." And they said to him, "We were not born of sexual immorality. We have one Father, even God." So in Genesis 3, you have four actors. You have the serpent and his seed, and you have the woman and her seed. And they are in a conflict together. And now Jesus is making a reference to Genesis chapter 3. He's telling them, your father is the serpent. You're doing like he did. You are a liar, and you are seeking to kill me, just as the serpent slew humanity with his lies. And you say, but where is Mary as Eve? Well, she is not discussed directly, but this part where they say, we were not born of sexual immorality, they're saying something about Jesus, and therefore they are saying something about Mary. And I'm in agreement with Don Carson and others that this doesn't make any sense if John doesn't know about the virgin birth. Some people say that. Well, John does know about the tradition of the virgin birth, and that's why we have this discussion here about Jesus' mother and the question of sexual immorality, because they're trying to deconstruct the virgin birth tradition, and they're trying to steal Jesus's divine paternity. It's not that he was born of God and a sexually pure woman. Rather, he was born of sexual immorality, and they, the Judaioi, their paternal line is divine, not Jesus. So very interesting thing happening here in relationship to Genesis 3. And if that's true, then Mary was playing the role of Eve in John chapter 8. Now, if in John's Gospel Mary potentially plays the role of Eve from the sixth day, who is symbolically bride of Christ at the wedding and mother of Christ and his disciple, the beloved disciple, we have to ask the question, do similar patterns show up in the book of Revelation? When the mother of the Messiah appears in chapter 12, she is described in Eve-like language from Genesis 3. Look at this. You have the ancient serpent, you have deceptive speech, you have the woman having a painful birth, just like the woman in Genesis 3. The serpent has seed, it's in conflict with the woman's seed. The serpent's head wound is being carried by the beast in Revelation 13. And so all this same language, Genesis 3 language, shows up in Revelation 12 in relationship to the Messiah's mother. And just as Mary was the mother of Jesus and the beloved disciple in John's Gospel, so the mother of Jesus in Revelation is also the mother of his disciples. Then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her seed, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. Interesting. In the symbolism, Jesus' mother is also the mother of his disciples. Same thing happens in John's Gospel at the cross with the beloved disciple. And the mother of Jesus and his disciples in Revelation becomes his bride in the end of the story. Very strange, but many commentators have noted that the woman in chapter 12 is the same as the woman in chapters 21 and 22, but in one passage she is mother, and in the other she is wife, symbolically speaking. You might think this is weird, that even on the symbolic level, to talk about the woman here, who represents the people of God in the book of Revelation. Nevertheless, there appears to be allusions to Mary too. But even to talk symbolically and metaphorically about a mother becoming the bride of her son, well, this is scriptural language. Revelation is getting this from Isaiah 62. For as a young man marries a young woman, so shall your sons marry you. And as the bridegroom rejoices over the bride, so shall your God rejoice over you. And so this is, it seems weird, but it's actually just scriptural language that we've already encountered in the Old Testament. And I think this citation from Boxall is helpful. If it just seems too weird, even symbolically, to start talking about the Messiah's mother becoming his bride, look at what Boxall says. Literally, this would represent the most perverse kind of incest. Understood apocalyptically, it proclaims the most intimate of relationships between God and Christ, God's people, and the community of which they are part. I mean, look, at the end of the book of Revelation, there's a scene where a lamb is marrying a woman, right? Now, if you took that too literally, obviously that would be a serious violation of the Mosaic law. But nobody does that. Everybody knows this is symbolic language, and John uses some very striking images. So if he can talk about an animal marrying a woman, then he can use this Zion language, mother marrying her son language, that he derives from Isaiah 65 as well, that should not be scandalous. So let's set Mary aside for a moment and focus in on Jesus as a second Adam in his crucifixion. When Pontius Pilate introduces Jesus to the crowd, he uses very interesting language. Behold the man, anthropos. Now, N.T. Wright and others have suggested this is Adam language, that Jesus is the man because he's a representative human, the way that Adam was. And keep in mind that even though man, anthropos, is a very generic word, John has used it in some very nuanced and specific ways. For example, in John chapter 2, it says that Jesus did not entrust himself to any man, anthropos, because he knew what was in a man, anthropos, and then a man comes to see him by night, an anthropos, whose name is Nicodemus. And so this is a loaded word in John's gospel, so there's no reason to think it couldn't be used here in a very loaded and sophisticated way as well. Jesus is presented with a royal robe at the time of his crucifixion, just as Adam and Eve were royalty who ruled over creation. he's given a crown of thorns, just as Adam was presented with the agricultural curse of thorns and thistles. Immediately after Jesus is presented with his crown of thorns, he's given the death sentence, just as immediately after the agricultural curse, Adam is given his death sentence. There are only two places in John's Gospel where wine is consumed. One is at the wedding of Cana on the 6th day, and the other is Jesus consuming the bitter wine upon the cross on the 6th day of the last week in that Gospel. And remember, as I already said, in 3rd Baruch and other ancient Jewish texts, the consumption of the tree of knowledge was often compared to consuming wine. Immediately after Jesus consumes the wine, it says it is finished. And finally, John tells us the Sabbath has arrived. Jesus has completed his work week when he finishes his work on the cross. And the Sabbath day that had been, put off since the beginning of John's Gospel has finally arrived. And then finally, Jesus is placed in a tomb in which no man has ever laid, just as Adam was the first person to be told he would be placed in the ground. One interpreter observes the reverse combination of these elements: hearing something that leads to fear, and then a question about where. God asks Adam, "Where are you?" Adam says, "I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid." When Pilate heard the word about Jesus being Son of God, he was afraid. He asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" The language is strikingly similar in these two episodes. Anathen is a well-known wordplay in John's Gospel. It can mean either again or from above, and it's used in John chapter 3 in the conversation with Nicodemus. Well, this word occurs again at the Passion. Jesus has a garment that is ekton anothen, from above, understood to mean sewn from above. But some have seen this as another double entendre. It is both sewn from above and it is a garment from above. Now, if so, it could be the reversal of Adam's story. At the fall, Adam is given a garment by God to clothe him. As Jesus reverses the fall, his garment is taken away and he returns to the barren state of the garden. Perhaps the most commented upon element is the garden that is mentioned 4 times and then the reference to a gardener. Mary Magdalene will think that Jesus is the gardener on Easter morning. The other Gospels do not contain a reference to a gardener or a garden, but John has these 5 references. Now, when does John ever repeat a setting so many times? It seems if John intends for us to read Adam and Eve resonances out of this story, it makes sense that he would repeat the garden context so many times. I actually read a scholar who is trying to play all this down, and he just says, you know what, historically there was a garden there, and that's why John mentions it. Yeah, that's why he mentions it 4 times, and then has Jesus as a gardener? Come on, there has to be something going on here. This is the comparison that has captured the imagination of Christian art throughout the centuries, and we will end with this. Adam goes to sleep and receives his bride from the opening in his side. Jesus dies, and then the life-giving waters for his church, which represent the Spirit, they come out from his side. John is the only gospel to contain this detail, and he makes a big deal out of it, saying, "He who saw it is borne witness, and his testimony is true," so on. John has already been clear that Jesus is the bridegroom and that the water from his side gives life to his bride. Combine this with all the garden references, with it being the 6th day and everything else that we've discussed, and it seems to be meaningful, and it seems to be saying that Jesus is the new Adam, and he is reversing the story of the first Adam so that we can once again know life with God within the Garden of Eden.